I'm going to talk to you about the extraordinary design of the Bombardier Beetle. And this work was done when I was still employed at the University of Leeds. I'm an emeritus professor now of thermodynamics at the University of Leeds, which basically is an excuse for them saying, we're not going to pay you anymore. If you do any work, hard cheese, you know, you have to do it on your own. So fair enough, I don't mind doing it because I'm interested in the work, and I'm actually connected with, as was mentioned earlier, Liberty University in Virginia and a few other places as well. So, so the work is still ongoing, actually. It certainly is a fascinating piece of work which I've been privileged to be involved in. It really is insect inspiration, as I've indicated there. And it's all to do with biomimetics, which is learning design from creation to inspire innovative engineering. And that's really what all this is about. And we need then to just put some ground rules down as I develop this talk. Because some people might say, you're just saying because you don't understand something that it's the God of the gaps idea. And many theistic evolutionists, I hope you understood this in my previous talk, that one of the biggest problems that we have is within the church, people trying to say that God used evolution. And they particularly will use this argument against the creation thinking person. Oh, you're just appealing to the God to fill in the gaps of lack of knowledge. But actually, it's the opposite. So this applies both to the secularist who opposes us, and also the theistic evolutionist. It's not what we do not know, it is what we do know that points to design. Because as I quoted in the first talk, the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So can I therefore encourage people to not listen to such an argument, because the scriptures tell us that we're to expect that the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. And Colossians 1 also tells us that all things were created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Things which are seen, which I read in the first talk, I read this verse, things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. So we need to be very careful about giving way on this point, that somehow it's due to ignorance that we believe in a God of creation. No, it's the very things that we know which tell us. If I was to look at a rocket, like a Saturn V rocket 50 years ago, when Werner von Braun was aiming at the moon, Werner von Braun had carefully put together all the intricate design, based, of course, on his V2 work in the Second World War. We know all that. But, you know, if I was to look at a Saturn V rocket, it would be that which I didn't understand, which would immediately make me think, oh, you know, there must be a mind behind this because I can't understand where this came from. No, that might be an argument, because I'm not saying that I understand everything about rockets. But the more that I examined the Saturn V rocket, the more I understood the gyro system, which keeps that massive tonnage of metal upright in the sky as it lifts off, because that was a big problem when these rockets were being made. The more I consider all the intricate controls that went on even 50 years ago, before the advent of massive computer power that we have today. But there was very simple computers going on, by today's standards, simple. But when I look into that, when I look into the 5 huge, powerful engines which would lift that machine off, the more I understood the combustion, the more I considered what was going on, the more I would say, there is a brilliant mind which has put this together. And it's the same with creation. So these are very important fundamental points that I just wanted to get right. We're going to consider a number of things in this talk. We're going to consider where it's found briefly, then I'm going to major on how it works, and then what we did and what we copied, because that's what we did at the University of Leeds, and the computer modeling that we did, and then a few things to do with how the experiments worked and the applications. Look, we're not going to go into all these things in the same detail as how it works. That's going to be the main aspect that we're dealing with tonight. First of all, then, where is it found? Well, it's found in Asia, found in North America, South America, Africa, rather larger ones. Europe, actually, we do have some. They're rather small, but we do find them. And particularly in the south of England, usually under rocks and usually close to water, because they need water and they prefer to be hidden like most beetles do. And they are essentially feeding off meat. So they're meat eaters. And they have been known, we think, it's known that they feed sometimes in a cannibalistic way of other dead bombardier beetles, but they will feed basically in a carnivorous way. Now, the bombardier beetle has some amazing features. It ejects a mixture of chemically heated steam and noxious chemicals out of its back end. This is a separate system to its digestive tract. So I want to be respectful in saying this, but basically when it makes this noise, it's not like we might make a noise after we've had a very nice meal. You get my meaning. It's got a very separate system to its digestive tract, and it wards off predators such as ants, birds, spiders and frogs, which are trying to eat this. It's even been known for a frog to swallow the bombardier beetle, and it's blasting inside its stomach, and of course it makes it feel awful, and it spits it out again. And usually there is a winning stroke by the bombardier beetle in that it's able to keep blasting, and it usually therefore makes its predator the one to lose. However, it has been known for some creatures to grab it from the front and bury its apparatus at the back, which is where all the dirty work is done, into the ground. One rodent, I think it's some type of vole or some creature, mole, which actually buries the behind into the ground. Then it doesn't blast to the predator, but it's very rare that the predator wins. The beetle usually wins, doesn't usually cause death to its predator. A spider might be known to lose a leg in the battle, but spiders can always regrow those legs. The main thing is that it's got this movable exhaust turret, and it can even blast over its head in any direction, a bit like a tank, you know, but it can even bring the nozzle of the tank right over its head, which is really something stunning to actually see. I've shared the sound, so you should be able to hear this on your computer as I play it. This is what you hear in the laboratory if you see a bombardier beetle. That's what you actually hear in the laboratory. Quite extraordinary. But in order for you to get a bit more of an idea as to what's going on, I'm now going to play a clip from the BBC film, the film Alien Empire, where you can actually see the beetle blasting in a bit of slow motion.
Few creatures will risk annoying a bombardier beetle. It mixes a cocktail of deadly chemicals in a special chamber. They react and explode at boiling point from its rear end in an awesome chemical weapon.
So now let's see these really slowed down. The work that I did was in conjunction with Professor Tom Eisner of Cornell University. And I owe an awful lot to Tom, who has died now from Parkinson's disease. But I had the privilege of going to his laboratory and speaking with him and observing these beetles. And this is him in the film Secret Weapons, published by the BBC, which actually shows him working on these creatures.
One of the really amazing things about this animal is its ability to spray in a very beautifully aimed fashion. And that shows up very nicely when you put the animal on indicator paper. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pinch very lightly one leg after the other, just as if I were an ant biting these legs. I'm going to start with the right hind leg, right front leg, left front leg,
At 400 frames per second, the action has been slowed down, but not enough to see the individual pulses. So they went to a lab and filmed the beetle at an even faster speed, at an incredible 4,000 frames a second.
oh,
There were the pulses, each one corresponding to the individual bursts of sound.
Now you can see that this was an old film and old technology, a cine camera being used there. But this was back in the 80s, 90s that he did this work, where he clearly showed that there was individual blasts going on, which is what makes the notes. You actually hear a ee, which I played to you earlier from this beetle. And that ee represents between 400 to 500 cycles per second, a bit like you might play middle C, 512 cycles per second, sorry, the C above middle C on a piano. Middle C is 256 cycles per second. So the C above is about 512. So it's in that area. And he knew that there was a note. And he very cleverly showed by running the cine camera very slowly that there was individual blasts going on. And this is what is now demonstrated in the valve system, which comes when you examine through electron micrographs or electron photos here, electron photography, electron micrograph photography, where you can actually see that with the electron microscope, blowing up these tiny little 1 millimeter chambers. They're approximately 1 millimeter long, and there's two of them. This is really a combustion chamber, so it's a twin carburetor. Rather neat to find this. And what we're looking at then is what is going on in the exhaust system initially. And the yellow is pointing to the inlet valve, right? And the exhaust system is there with the orange arrow. So there's two arrows here. I can't use a pointer easily, but so I'll just have to describe it. The yellow arrow is pointing to the inlet tubes, which have been severed. And you're looking at what looks like two boxing gloves. And you can see that there is an orange arrow, which is pointing to the exhaust system. Now, Tom Eisner realized that there was an inlet valve, but he hadn't realized that there was an exhaust valve. I said to him, when I looked at the orange arrow and I looked at the exhaust tube, I said, it looks like you've sliced longitudinally along the tube. He says, no, I haven't. That is actually hard cuticle, and there is a soft membrane which is lying flat on what looks like hard cuticle next to it. So just to give you a diagram to explain this, this was a very important moment when I realized with Tom Eisner that there was an exhaust valve. He was saying that red line is that the membrane was lying flat against the hard cuticle as you're looking down it. Then it lifts under pressure. So that membrane is like a balloon valve. It actually lifts under pressure. And when the pressure goes up, as the diagram shows on the left, which is an article published some years ago in Physics World, and I produced an article that you can find on the internet, which actually describes this valve system. When that membrane lifts up, then the exhaust comes out. So I said to Professor Eisner, there is an exhaust valve here, and he agreed. And we then worked on this a bit further, and he sent me a lot of his wonderful pictures of the inside of the combustion chamber. And basically what is happening, as has been described by others before Tom Eisner, is that you've got a chemical system. The person who did the chemistry actually was a German called Schildknecht, who was himself a Nazi sympathizer. So he worked some years ago on the Bombardier Beetle, and very interesting, the side story that's interwoven with this work is that a lot of the work was done by Germans initially, particularly Schildknecht. And of course, Tom Eisner himself is or was a person who had been brought up, or as a young child, who was in Germany, and he had to flee Nazi Germany. And he told me these stories about how he had to flee initially to South America and then eventually came to the United States. So there's an interesting side story to this work on the Bombardier Beetle. And there's another connection with Nazi Germany, as you'll see in a moment. But so Schildknecht, anyway, back to the main story, he showed that hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide were coming, as this schematic shows, coming into the combustion chamber. Then enzymes, which act like catalysts, cause that reaction to go very fast and cause the inlet valve to close. I'll show you how that works a bit later. The inlet valve stops more fuel and oxidant. The oxidant is hydrogen peroxide, not air. So it's hydroquinone combining with hydrogen peroxide, which gives off an oxygen, which then produces this blast, which actually is through, as we discovered, an exhaust valve, which then suddenly made me realize that we could copy that inlet and outlet exhaust valve system. Here comes the connection with Germany again, because you probably know, though most of you, that England in the later years of the war came under vicious attack by V1 doodlebugs, which were powered in a very similar way to the Bombardier Beetle. That's the other connection with Nazi Germany. So the V1 was actually burning gasoline, petrol, in air, And so the combustors, the combustible material, was not hydroquinone, it was petrol or gasoline burning with the oxygen from the air. And it was repeated pulse combustion. So the very burning caused a rise in pressure, which then pushed the carbon dioxide and the exhaust out of the back, which then pushed the V1 forwards. Then the pressure went down, an inlet valve opened again, and in came more air and more fuel. And this burnt from the heat of the previous explosion, closed the inlet valve, and again out of the end of the rocket, which was powering this flying bomb. And of course, when it ran out of fuel, it came down over London and the home counties in Surrey and Sussex and so on. So these were powered in a very similar way. And it's really essentially a gun at the back of the Beetle, which is being fired not just once, but repeatedly. And it's being fired at roughly 500 times a second. And it might go on maybe for maybe 5-6 seconds. So that would mean that you're doing 2,500, 3,000 shots. Then it will rest. Then it will do it again for quite a number of seconds. So it could be 5 or 6 seconds doing it again, and then again, and then again. And this creature is doing an amazing set of explosions repeatedly. So we were trying to understand how it worked. And of course, the chemical system is very interesting. It's not what we copied, and please understand that, but what you've got is hydroquinone, the C6H6O2, plus hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, going to benzoquinone, C6H4O2, and water. Now that's the overall reaction, but you need hydrogen peroxide combining hydroquinone. It's going to be a slow reaction. So you need enzymes, a catalyst, which is either catalase or peroxidase, which we have in our bodies. And this Beetle has it in the inside of the combustion chamber. Now, the reason I put here Catalysis 101 is that really there was a certain gentleman from Oxford, whom you can guess what his name was, who actually tried to say before a class of children whom he was lecturing to in what is called the Faraday lectures at the Royal Institution in London, which was set up by Michael Faraday, who would turn over in his grave to know that Richard Dawkins was actually doing at times the Christmas lectures, which are done every year. Anyway, he said in this lecture many years ago, this is a young Dawkins you're going to see, that you didn't need the hydroquinone. And he actually made a crucial mistake in his lecture. Let me give you a clip of him doing this. No. This is 1991, so many years ago, 30 years ago.
In fact, the hydroquinone does nothing at all. We can put that on one side. The true story is that hydrogen peroxide on its own does decompose to form oxygen and water, but it needs a catalyst under normal conditions to do that. This black powder here is a catalyst. It's not the catalyst that the Bombardier Beetle uses. The Bombardier Beetle does use a catalyst, and it does in fact squirt this hot substance into the face of its enemy. But if you put a catalyst into a weak solution of hydrogen peroxide, then you're going to get a little bit of bubbling, and it's a little bit warm. That might have some effect on the predator. That might slightly deter a predator, and it would be not particularly dangerous to the beetle. Now we've got a smooth gradient, a bit more concentration of hydrogen peroxide, and that's distinctly warm. That would work more effectively against a predator. And by moving gradually up the slope, gradually increasing the concentration of hydrogen peroxide, we can end up with... So there is a smooth slope all the way up to the effective deterrent against a predator.
So he's trying to argue that you actually don't need the hydroquinone, and he's trying to actually gun at the creation argument that this is not an example of design, but it actually could have come about by random mutations, as he said, a gradual slope, a gradual mutation change. But he's actually not correct, as this next little bit of work will show you, because you need the catalysts, which are peroxidase and catalase. And I went to Liberty University and I asked Garth Hewitt to actually just show me the effect of catalysts to make a reaction go much faster. And importantly, what the catalyst does, and I'll show you the chemistry of this in a moment, it produces a much faster reaction and it produces hydrogen on the way. And it's the hydrogen-oxygen reaction, which is absolutely vital to get the heat. Let me play you this video.
Drop it straight down the center. Yep. That was a platinum catalyst.
Platinum catalyst.
And now it's your quinones formed. See, that's orange?
Yes, that's the orange. Thank you for showing me this, Garth. This is excellent.
Yeah, that orange there would be your benzoquinone. The bottom orangey color.
So now let me just put a little bit more flesh on the bones of this point. So this is a bit detailed, but please take a note that the overall reaction produces, it's in negative terms because you're dealing with, this is just a convention that if you have delta H negative, it means that you've got exothermic reaction. So the overall reaction is about 203 joules per mole, right? But it's actually made up of a series of steps. The first reaction I'm going to put down here is the one which, one of the ones that Dawkins dismissed. This is the hydroquinone, which breaks up and is able to produce benzoquinone, and please note it produces hydrogen. But you need an energy input to get that to work. You understand me on this? This is important. Then you've got the next reaction, which is hydrogen peroxide producing water and oxygen. And it is true that that is exothermic, but that is half as exothermic as the overall reaction. It's minus 95 joules per mole. So Dawkins was trying to say, oh, that's the way it works, but it isn't, because this is the vital reaction which you must have, which is the hydrogen and the oxygen producing water. And the exothermicity of that is minus 286 joules per mole. In other words, when you actually add those up, you get the 203 approximately joules per mole. So the reactions which Dawkins missed were this one, which is the first one. And of course, he was bound to miss the hydrogen and the oxygen reaction. So when he dismissed the hydroquinone, he was actually dismissing a very important part of the chemistry. And it's not simple, the chemistry. It's very complicated chemistry. And of course, the catalysts are vital to make the hydroquinone break up into benzoquinone and hydrogen. You've still got energy left over, which then creates the big amount of energy is the hydrogen and the oxygen, and you've got way enough energy from there to actually deal with the endothermic reaction which you needed at the beginning, right? It's not simple chemistry. He was trying to make out it was simple, and of course it's not. So I rather think that Dawkins missed a very important point there. Let me just bring you another point to this chemistry set. There is an amazing inlet system, which I said I'd come to, which this is a rather less detailed electron micrograph, which shows you the huge long tube which is coming in, which is an extremely narrow diameter tube in which hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide are both made, it's believed, by some sort of bacterial reaction, although it's not fully understood. And that is still yet to be explored. Then there is the combustion chamber, which is there, and there's two of them, as you can see. And those combustion chambers are where the chemical reaction takes place. We have not copied the chemistry, but I'm showing you this to give you some idea of what really is happening with the Beetle. The Beetle has, in this combustion chamber, it's a bit like a glove, and the two fingers that you can see on each combustion chamber pinch the inlet tube to stop more combustible material coming in under pressure. So it is, as I said, twin carburetors going on, and Christine Ortiz from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, using laser tomography, has shown that both combustion chambers operate together. You can see them both operating as she fired a laser through a working Bombardier Beetle to show that this was going on. So now what did we do? That's how it works. Well, we mimicked the valve system, not the chemistry. First of all, we did some computer modeling. And this was done before we had the injection of a lot of money from a company called Swedish Biomimetic 3000. And we carefully made a system in the computer where we reckoned that the shape of the chamber was probably not that vital, although we did think it was at one point. That actually we reckoned that the volume of the chamber was what we needed to simulate in the computer program, which was CFX. And this is 1/8 of the cross section that we've put through here is really 1/8 of the cylinder that you're looking at here. And there's a small little tube coming out, which is roughly the right size to simulate the outlet exhaust of the Bombardier Beetle. So we made some assumptions here. We're dealing with a very tiny chamber. As I said, it's less than 1 millimeter long, and the volume of the chamber we made roughly the same as to what we estimated the volume of the Bombardier Beetle chamber to be. Then we estimated the size of the tube. We took a 50 micron radius for the tube coming out. We took a 307 micron radius for the main cylinder, which is simulating the combustion chamber. We estimated the pressure to be a fairly high 0.1 of a bar, so that's pretty high for this very, very small chamber. And the vapor pressure for a steam, water to steam transition would be about, would be a little bit over 100 degrees centigrade, about 105 centigrade, 378 degrees K. So now we're going to see what happens when we remove the dividing chamber, the dividing membrane, I should say, from the water, which is the cold blue on the left, and the red on the right is basically just meaning we don't have to model the air as well. We're going to say it's already got the second phase, that's the gaseous phase, that's water vapor. That's incidental. We're just dealing with two phases, and we're just simulating the release of the valve. We're going to assume laminar flow, and then we're going to let this go. You're going to see an arrow going from left to right, because you'll get the impression of water, as it were. You would have thought from the way that the graphics is displayed, you'll think, but it's going from right to left, but it's clearly going from left to right, and I'm just reminding you of that. And we're going to go in steps of 0.06 milliseconds. So it's very, very fast, and we're going to see what happens. So this is really just water going to steam. That's all you've got here. You haven't got any of the chemistry. So watch what happens. You'll see the little clock at the top, and you'll see that the blue is gradually becoming the light blue, green, yellow, brown is essentially steam, and red is certainly steam. So once you've got to the yellow, you're really into steam. And what this is showing is that the water is emptying very, very fast from this chamber. We're about 1.3 milliseconds now, and by the time we actually get to the end of this set of simulations, or this simulation I should say, will be up to roughly nearly 3 milliseconds. So this is showing that in the simulation that we've got something rather like a pressure cooker going on, where you're releasing the membrane and the water is boiling off. So we showed that we could do this in about 3 milliseconds, which would be equivalent to about 300 cycles per second. We thought we really got it about right, because that's what we'd observed in the video that I showed you earlier of the Bombardier Beetle. So we actually decided to build a rig, not the same size as to what I showed you. We're actually going to 20 times the size, so about 2 centimeters. Initially, we had a perspex model, and we filled it with water. We electrically heated it, and we've got an inlet valve, which is coming from the bottom, and an exhaust valve going out on the left. There is another valve, which is a safety valve that we were using just in case things exploded and went wrong and we needed to reduce the pressure. And this is what we got. This was our very first, or one of the very first experiments. Now you can see a very sophisticated container to take the steam on the right. Very sophisticated indeed. It was just a bin, a black plastic bin. But you can also see a Malvern laser going across the spray. And we weren't controlling the spray very well, but we were essentially opening up the valve when we wanted to, unlike the Beetle, which passively opens the valve under pressure. Well, that was our early experiments. Eventually, we began to get much more sophisticated, better experiments and much faster sprays and slightly larger devices. And this is the type of work. We were exceedingly pleased with these results because we were now controlling the spray, not only in terms of how fast the spray was coming out, how many times the ejection was taking place, but also how small the droplets were, which was determined by the size of the outlet valve. And remember, we're not doing any chemistry, we're just heating essentially water, but of course it can be fuel, for fuel of cars, fuel of diesel engines, where again, this is a means of vaporizing, in that case, fuel. So the major features of what we had achieved was understanding the Bombardier Beetle itself, that it uses precise catalytic chemistry, precisely timed inlet valve and exhaust valve, that it's using a controlled vapor explosion. It has a sensory mechanism, which we haven't copied at all, and as far as I know, nobody has done that, which actually moves the turret in any direction it wishes. It produces hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinone. It can go up, this is the Beetle, to 400 to 500 times per second, and it can maintain a burst for about, as I said, 3 seconds, or maybe even up to 5 or 6 seconds. So it can be going up to 3,000 explosions, or certainly well above 1,500. And then, of course, we had learnt from the biomimetics that we'd done, taking the Bombardier Beetle and applying it to engineering, that this was an example of pulse combustion or oscillating combustion. It's a classic example of biomimetics. We'd copied the core technology of the valves. We hadn't copied the chemistry. I'm repeating that so you understand that. It has applications to fuel injectors using fuel, not water. It has application to pharmaceutical, nebulizers, aerosols and air fresheners, fire suppression, and even fire extinguishers. Just one last little point before we close, and that's this, that for fuel injection systems, you want very, very small droplets. And so you want a very, very wide angle. You're not interested in, sorry, let me just put that back. You're not interested in large droplets and a large throw. But let me just show you this last clip, which makes a very good point from David Attenborough, one of his later films, other than the Alien Empire that I showed you earlier. This was some years ago in the BBC Life series, but it was well beyond the Alien Empire film that I showed you earlier. This shows a tremendous throw of the Bombardier Beetle.
But the master of chemical warfare is the Bombardier Beetle. It can create a chemical reaction within its body so violent that boiling caustic liquid explodes out of its abdomen. By pulsing the jet 500 times a second, it keeps its rear end just cool enough to prevent it being cooked.
Well, actually, that last point isn't quite true, because it doesn't keep itself cool by blasting. It keeps itself cool because it's got a very different thermal conductivity on the material around the combustion chamber, which means that it insulates itself from the heat from that blast. But nevertheless, it does show very clearly there is a very long throw of about 200 times its own length of the combustion chamber. So it's a 1 millimeter chamber, and it can blast about 20 centimeters. We could show that with our 2 centimeter chamber, under certain conditions where we actually change the size of the valve, change the heating of the chamber, and a number of other features that we could control, we could get sometimes a throw of 4 meters right across a room from a 2 centimeter chamber. And again, it was a throw ratio of about 200. And this has great interest for fire extinguishers. Now, the Bombardier Beetle, then, what we've learned is the physics of the chamber and the valve system, and we can alter the timing, the pressure relief, exit valve, we can control the modality and the droplet size, and many other features. Now, we have shown that this has applications to pharmaceuticals, to a needless injector, fire extinguishers, fuel injector, aerosols, and aeroponics. Actually, the lead ones have been the pharmaceutical ones, the fire extinguisher, the fuel injector, and the aerosols. The droplet size for each of these applications for the pharmaceuticals is very, very small. For the fire extinguishers, it's fairly large. For fuel injectors, still reasonably large, and aerosols quite small. And indeed, you can get different modality of the spray. It was this work which actually gave us the 2010 award for outstanding contribution to innovation and technology, shared, of course, with Swedish Biomimetics, which had sponsored us. In closing, can I just mention the fire extinguisher application? Because the fire extinguisher work is still carrying on now. And you may be aware that both in Australia and in the west coast of America, not far from you in British Columbia, there have been some major fires. And let me just mention these. In 2018 in California, terrible events took place where people not only died, but the firefighters died as well as they were trying to deal with the fire. So it's good to have a system, is it not, which you can develop where you can shoot water and maybe a bit of vapor as well into the seat of a terrible wildfire. Australia, the following year, had terrible fires where vast quantities of forest and were destroyed, and again firefighters died. Well, we believe that using this technology we can perhaps save some firefighter lives where they can shoot water to the seat of a fire. The work has been patented. 3 main patents have been granted and the 4th there mentioned. And more information is on the Bombardier Beetle website, which is shown there, where a number of films, some of the ones that I've shown you, are there for you to look at. But this is the time for asking questions. Thank you very much for listening to me. May this work be a demonstration of Romans 1:20. The invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power in Godhead. This belief I've had that this beetle is designed opened up the research, contrary to many people who say that if you take a creation position, it closes down research. The glory is not to me, but to the Lord God who even made this humble beetle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McIntosh. What a fascinating study into this. I don't know if you've probably been the one that's been studying this the most. Would you say that, do you know of anybody who's studied other than your Swedish counterparts? Or
There are others who've been looking at it.
Maybe
I've enjoyed it, certainly.
From the biological perspective, probably. Yeah, one great question to start us off. I'll get into closing after, but we got a couple of questions coming in, which are good. Would you say this feature is a result of the fall after Adam and Eve's sin, or would this have been in the original creation? Or I would add, could have been like part of a designed adaptation that came in later? Or yeah, how would you answer
that? Well, thank you, Daniel, for this question. This is not an easy question to answer, but I think that all creatures which have this predator-prey connection in today's world are really using apparatus which was probably there for different reasons. Let me just suggest, I do not know, this is just speculation, that before the fall, it may be necessary for the beetle to soften up very hard fruit, which was necessary for it to use. And even today, it's sometimes very difficult to get at very hard fruit, and it needs softening. And it may be that that was the original purpose. And of course, you can always say that God had given sufficient ability in creatures to have something used for one purpose to be used in a totally different way in a fallen world. And today we have a very different ecology where one creature is preying on another and basically feeding on it. And there is a big food chain today. The ecology wasn't the same in the pre-fall world. So that would be my answer there. And if you want to know more, there is some discussion of this in the Answers Book 1, published by Answers in Genesis, where myself and Bodhi Hodge address that question.
Great, thank you. Here's a question by David. I first learned about the Bombardier Beetle in the 1978 book by Dr. Doing Gish Dinosaurs, those terrible lizards. Do you think similar chemicals and exhaust system could have been found in some species of dinosaurs, from which stories of fire-breathing dragons arose, for example, St. George and the Dragon, or in China?
I very much doubt that they're the same chemicals. And I cannot be sure about whether dragons were definitely fire-breathing. Obviously, it is believed by many that there is evidence for, but it's not direct evidence that some dinosaurs were breathing fire. But it is possible that they had the apparatus. Some of the dinosaur skulls tend to indicate that there seems to be another compartment which could have been a chamber where maybe methane, which is well known that some mammals that we have today, like cows, actually have a lot of methane from the vegetables that they are eating. So it's plausible that a hadrosaur, which is the creature that I'm particularly thinking of, could have had this apparatus in it for breathing fire, and that may be, as the questioner indicated, but it's speculation that I'm a bit hesitant, to be frank, because I don't think it's proven either way.
Right. So I thought hadrosaur is a duck-billed dinosaur, I believe, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, they have this cavity, and there's
the skulls are rather odd in the way that they're portioned, and we don't fully understand how they operated, but it could be. It is true. It could be that might be a means by which those creatures breathe fire.
Right. Yeah. Especially, yeah, it'd be interesting to find if there's any other structures there that could have be used for something like that. Go to another person's question, Haslin. How did you get into this particular beetle research? I think you answered a little bit of that at the end, but we want to get in a little bit more into it.
Yeah, the way I did it was basically I was inspired by seeing the early work of Tom Eisner. That particular clip that I showed you where the beetle, he slowed the cine camera right down, and I could see that he'd done very systematic work to show that there was an explosion going on. That really got me going. I thought, wow, there is a creature here which uses combustion. I know a little bit about combustion because I've studied it for many years. I've written papers on it. I understand the way combustion works. And to see that operating in nature was just amazing. So I thought, well, I'll study it. So that was the beetle itself inspired me, and I was very grateful to the work of Tom Eisner. He gave me a signed copy of his book, For the Love of Insects, which I've got on my bookshelf behind me, and I really appreciated his early work. You've got another question here from David Butler.
Yeah, I guess sounds like a follow-up. I'm not quite sure what this is. Maybe you know more. In the Bombardier Beetle, what chemical comprises the inhibitor? I don't remember.
Well, I think this idea of an inhibitor came from Duran Gish. Now, I don't like to take issue here with Duran Gish, because obviously he passed away now, is with the Lord, but he was a great person, but I'm not quite sure what Duran meant by an inhibitor, because I've not seen clearly evidence of yet another chemical. I think it's rather a negative argument here. It's the lack of a catalyst, and that's the way it should be put.
Right.
You haven't got yet another chemical trying to stop the chemistry going on. What you've got is initially the hydroquinone and the hydrogen peroxide, as Dawkins rightly said, he did say some things correctly in his little clip, that without the catalyst, you won't actually get the reaction going. So you've got, the reaction's not going to get going. So that's really rather a negative, if you like, an inhibition, negative way of putting it. I would just simply say you've got lack of catalyst in some places initially. Then the catalyst comes in, which we believe is the solid fibers. I didn't say that very clearly as I was going through the talk, but the solid fibrous material coming into the chamber, we believe is where the solid catalase and peroxidase is causing the reaction to go 1,000 times faster, or of that order. And so I don't believe that there is a clear example of yet another chemical on top of that.
Yeah, my understanding is until it gets to chamber, combustion chamber, it's in separate.
That is interesting. Yeah. It's coming down an inlet tube, I didn't stress this at the time, but both reactants, both the chemicals which are going to eventually react, which is the hydroquinone and the hydrogen peroxide, are coming down the same tube. Tom Eister stressed that to me. Now, because it's very, very thin, there's very little room for any development of the reaction. And remember, it's very, very slow. But once it comes into the chamber, it sees the catalyst. These very reactants then really explode and come out in the exhaust.
Yeah, I guess, would you say unless that catalyst was there and the genes could program these two catalyst enzymes, I think if you wouldn't even get this feature like this. Yeah.
So it's a very complicated system. And Richard Dawkins got it wrong in his lecture to these young people, where he was misleading them, trying to say that it was just the hydrogen peroxide which was driving it. No, it's not. You've got to have the catalyst to actually liberate the hydrogen from the hydroquinone. Then the hydrogen and the oxygen, bang, they make a huge explosion.
Yeah, high energy.
Then high energy, which then, of course, feeds into the energy that you need to break the hydroquinone reaction. And of course, it produces overall an exothermic exhaust.
Yeah, that's where my understanding is, like, until these scientists become engineers, or at least some understanding, they don't understand how the whole system works. They have to learn engineering.
What you say is absolutely right.
Yeah.
You need proper engineering, and to be frank, Richard Dawkins really doesn't remember.
No. Yeah, I think the more we...
Or engineering 101.
Right. Yeah, because the more you look at these biological systems, the more they're systems. They're not just chemical.
That is a major point that you're making, David, that you need layered systems all working together, which is the irreducible complexity argument. And this is where we agree with the ID community.
Right. And I guess because people like Richard Dawkins or some other evolutionists might say, oh, you find certain features that other beetles or other insects, arthropods, so on, you find these in different animals, and somehow they all show up in this Bombardier beetle. How would you respond to that kind of argument?
Well, what you were saying earlier is the proper response, that you need all these systems to work for the beetle to actually operate properly. And those which are not, and there are some beetles, by the way, which no longer use heat. They just push out a quinone. They look a bit like Bombardier beetles, but it's reckoned by the evolutionists that these are the early ones, and that they're still around and they haven't developed their system properly. But actually, I think the evidence is that there is a mutation which has gone on, which has meant that the beetle doesn't operate quite as well and doesn't produce heat. It does dismiss some of the predators, but it's actually more vulnerable. So it's a mutation. And it's come from being a very good blaster to being not such a good blaster. So it's losing its ability, not the other way around.
And that's how, such a dichotomy between the creation position, evolutionary, naturalistic, universal common descent, is that we say all the information that was there originally, it's been devolving, you're separating out. So you get less functional or less survival ability. I guess like a toad, or the flick of its tongue would they go so fast they wouldn't have probably be all eaten up in no time. But I'm guessing so there's certain aspects that you either start from a perfect creation, you wind down. What is more happening? What do we see around us? Is it evolving or devolving with mutations and being less fit?
So we accept mutations, but mutations don't add information. They actually involve loss of information. And that's what I believe has happened with some of the technical term for this family of beetles is the Carabidae, the ground beetles, that they've lost the ability, some of them, to eject so wonderfully as the Bombardier beetles.
Right. Yeah, that's a good answer. Another question here from David again. What are the main similarities or differences between the beetle's ability to do this and how flamethrowers work?
Yeah, when you see a flamethrower, he will be actually, he'll be just absorbing initially some combustible gas, then lighting this combustible gas and throwing it. Yes, there is a bit of similarity. It's not a direct similarity, because for the beetle, he's actually producing it through a long chemical system, the inlet tube is what I'm referring to, and the combustion chamber, which is really separate to his edible, the mouth parts, which is using feeding. So what the flamethrower is doing is he's really misusing his mouth to actually push out the very gases that he's just absorbed in, right? And lighting them in order to throw a flame. So there's a little bit of similarity, but that's where it begins and ends.
Another interesting, good question. The Bombardier Beetle were the size of a car. How loud would the sound be?
Ah, right. Difficult to say that, but it would be big. Well, I can say it would be a great
even in the lab, the lab one where you were doing even just a little bit bigger, it sounded like it could be quite loud there.
Yes, it could be. The questioner is quite right that as you grow in size, then it would be you get a louder sound. So it's a bit like a backfiring of a car, which is when the combustion chamber at the front, the engine is not operating too well, and combustible gases come out of the exhaust. I'm talking about an internal combustion engine, right? Travels down the tube, the exhaust pipe, and then it combines with some air, which is at the exhaust, and bang, it causes a backfiring. So that's literally what is happening. Well, that is a very loud sound. It sounds like a gun going off. So that's what you get if you start going to very large examples of this system.
Yeah, and that rocket, I don't know if it was the V1 early on in the video too, that it could sound reminiscent to that probably too.
Yes, it could. Yes, it would sound similar to the V1.
Good. Okay, so we're getting late here. I want to close it off with just going over, going to share screen here about our association.
David,
oh yeah, go ahead.
If
Yes.
people want to know more, they're welcome to ask questions of you, which can be passed on to me.
I want to alert you to our website, creationbc.org, where you'll find more information about upcoming speakers. We have quite a number of articles that get posted every so often, a large number of quotes, how to get in contact with us, or you may want to just use our contact form here instead of directing it to the email. But also we have memberships that allow you to contribute to our association, help us spread this message and get speakers in, hopefully when we return to in person again, but also to have some other perks like free access to a large DVD lending library of many creation materials, wide varying interests levels or ages. And also I just want to, if you missed the first talk by Dr. McIntosh, feel free to go back to the speakers events, past events. Well, we're trying to get it on YouTube within a week, and you can see past presentations we've had as well. And then want to alert you to our bookstore too. If you go to store where we sell resources, we can ship to you. Again, if you're a member, you get free shipping. Just do a search for Andy McIntosh. We've got a number of DVDs, including mathematics. He's on about a hummingbird with David Reeves, but also some great resources in particular about Genesis for today, how we can trust the reliability of the Bible when it talks about origins and what it says in Genesis and how that's relevant for us today in our society. Again, go back to our first talk earlier today if you want to see how it directly impacts our understanding of our world and evolution. We'll try and get in some of those mini booklets that are more accessible, maybe, and very low cost. I think only $1 or $2. We'll see what the final cost comes in, but quite inexpensive. This is a wonderful book for quite a wide range of ages, including young learners. Many beautiful, colorful photos with Dr. Stuart Burgess, again, another engineer and scientist, about many aspects of creation, a lot of animals, plants, and so on. Just lovely, gets into a few pages for each subject, covers many aspects of design and creation. And also, Dr. McIntosh has even written Genesis 1 to 11, chapters 1 to 11, verse by verse commentary. So to allow the scriptures to speak for themselves, when you have many people saying, oh, even evangelicals, you can accept universal common descent, and that essentially God may have set it up in motion or so on, but instead of letting the scriptures speak for themselves and how they can be trusted. So if that's really something you want to delve into, encourage you get that as well. I'll turn it back to Dr. McIntosh then for a final word.
Thank you very much for sharing that, David, and it's been a privilege to work with you. And I just want to say that maybe I could just emphasize that you can't do everything by looking at the science to understand the gospel. I'm quite unashamed in saying, as I said in the first talk, that there are presuppositions. And my presupposition is quite unashamedly that I believe the Bible. And I find that the Bible is consistent with good science. The Bible is not primarily a scientific textbook, but when it does touch on the science, it actually makes very straightforward, correct statements in Genesis, but not just in Genesis. It touches on the science, for instance, when the Lord Jesus Christ calmed the water of Galilee, made the bread which was used for feeding the 5,000. It just multiplied it. And now we're not saying that everything can be answered by analysis of the natural world. We learn a lot, but it doesn't tell us everything. We have to turn to the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. And I'm saying that there is nothing inconsistent with good science and believing in the Bible and knowing that the Lord Jesus Christ not only is the creator, but what I stress early on in the first talk is that the Lord Jesus Christ came into this world to bleed and to die and to make an atonement for our sin. He took the punishment for our sin. And I became a Christian over 52 years ago, in January 1969. And I'm so grateful that somebody asked me a straight question, Andy, are you a Christian? And I said, I hope I am. And clearly by my answer, they knew I hadn't. He then explained to me that I needed to admit I'd done wrong, believe that Jesus Christ had died in my place, and I needed to commit my life to Christ. Admit, believe in what Jesus did on the cross, and commit your life to Christ. At that very young age of nearly 17, I handed over the keys of my life to the Lord Jesus Christ. My life then developed. I loved science, and I started reading around the science, realized that there was this issue of creation. And I thought, well, I believe the Bible. I believe that it's the Word of God. And I believed in Genesis. It took me a while to realize that it really was true. But my career, subsequently, I sought to follow and put Christ first in that career. And I believe God will bless any other young person today who wants to put Christ first in their science. And he will show you that there is no conflict between good science and believing in the Bible. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you, Dr. McIntosh. And I know you'll be an inspiration to many young people that they don't have to give up their just this desire that God's put in them, passion for maybe it's science or engineering or archaeology, history, whatever, that I think you're a great example of what it means to display the love of Christ and sharing the gospel in the place that God's placed you and given you the talents and gifts. So thank you so much, Dr. McIntosh, and hope people will,